Talking about the radial nerve is a terminal branch of the posterior cord and supplies majority muscles of the posterior compartment of the arm, forearm and the hand. It arises from the posterior cord of the brachial plexus with the root value of C5 to 8 and T1. It spirals posterior laterally around the humerus with the deep brachial artery in the radial spiral groove. It gives off the posterior cutaneous nerve in the forearm, which passes posterior to the lateral epicondyle and supplies the posterior forearm. It pierces the lateral intermuscular septum into the anterior compartment of the forearm and runs towards the elbow behind the brachialis and the brachioradialis. Brachialis in the medially and brachioradialis. It supplies the triceps, anconeus, brachioradialis and the lateral portion of the brachialis muscle. It gives the articular branch at the elbow joint and divides into deep and superficial branch at the cubital fossa. The deep branch is purely motor. It supplies the extensor carpi radialis brevis and the supinator muscle. It gives off the posterior interosseous nerve. Here is the posterior interosseous nerve. It gives off the posterior interosseous nerve that passes between the head of the supinator, and winds around and to the lateral aspect of the radial neck. It is not clearly indicated over here, but the posterior interosseous nerve passes between the head of the supinator muscle and winds around laterally to the radial neck. The posterior interosseous nerve supplies the extensor muscles of the posterior compartment of the forearm. The posterior interosseous nerve supplies the extensor muscles of the posterior compartment of the forearm. The superficial branch, talking about the superficial branch, it is purely sensory, located into the anterior lateral aspect of the forearm with the radial artery. Superficial branch supplies the supinator and the pronator teres. Supplies the supinator and the pronator teres muscle. It courses towards the wrist, enters the palm, dividing into the dorsal digital cutaneous branch. Talking about the branches of the radial nerve, articular branch is given at the elbow and the wrist joint. The muscular branch in the arm supplies the triceps brachii and the anconeus muscle. The superficial branch supplies to the cutaneous sensation to the dorsal aspect of the hand, dorsal aspect of the first to third, and the dorsal and lateral aspect of the fourth finger. Deep branch of the radial nerve, that is the posterior interosseous nerve, it supplies the extensor muscles in the forearm of the brachioradialis. Just revise it again. Talking about the radial nerve, it is the terminal branch of the posterior cord and supplies the majority muscles of the posterior compartment of the arm, forearm and the hand. It arises from the posterior cord of the brachial plexus and has a root value of C5 8 to T1. It spirals posterior laterally around the humerus with a deep brachial artery in the spiral groove, gives off the posterior cutaneous nerve of the forearm, which passes to the lateral condyle and it supplies the posterior forearm. It pierces the lateral intermuscular septum into the compartment of the forearm and runs towards the elbow between brachialis medially and brachioradialis. It supplies the triceps, anconeus, brachioradialis and lateral portion of the brachialis. It gives an articular branch at the elbow joint. It later on divides into deep and superficial branch at the cubital fossa. The deep branch is purely motor. And supplies the extensor carpi radialis brevis and the supinator muscle. It gives off the posterior interosseous nerve that passes between the head of the supinator and winds around the lateral aspect of the radial neck and ending into the posterior compartment of the forearm. The posterior interosseous nerve supplies the extensor muscles of the posterior compartment of the forearm. Talking about the superficial branch is purely sensory, located into the lateral aspect of the forearm with the radial artery. Superficially, it supplies the supinator and the pronator teres muscle, courses towards the wrist and enters the palm, dividing into the dorsal digitorum cutaneus branch. Talking about the branches of the radial nerve, the articular branch gives off at the elbow and the wrist. The muscular branch in the arm supplies the triceps brachii and the anconeus muscle. The superficial branch supplies to the cutaneous sensation of the dorsal aspect of the hand, the cutaneous aspect of the dorsal aspect of the hand, dorsal aspect of the first to third digital, and the dorsal lateral aspect of the fourth finger. The dorsal branch of the radial nerve, that is posterior interosseous nerve, supplies the extensor muscles in the forearm and the brachioradialis.